Hi everyone and welcome to UBS Trending. I'm your host, Anthony Pastore. The holiday shopping season is in full swing. However, this year is being overshadowed by the word that all shoppers dread, inflation. So, has inflation impacted the gift-giving spirit, or are folks throwing caution to the wind? We're going to discuss that right now with Jack Manley, global market strategist from JP Morgan Asset Management. Jack, good to have you here in the studio. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Anthony.
And
Thank
happy
you.
holidays.
Yeah.
We're talking about holiday shopping.
Happy holidays to you,
Thank
too.
you so much. It's hard to believe we're in December and we're already here. But another Black Friday has come and gone, and we're going to get to that in a moment. But I thought before we talked about Black Friday up until now, I wanted to get your take on the year that was, because inflation has been part of our lives for many months now. And of course, volatility in the markets has as well, which sometimes spooks, the average consumer. So what has the state of retailers and consumer discretionary been so far this year?
So it's an interesting question because given the inflationary impacts that you're talking about, Anthony, it can be a little bit difficult to suss out how the American consumer is faring with this challenging environment. And when we look at retail sales data, at least, and we can track that all the way through October of this year, that's when the last data point comes out, at a nominal level, which means when you don't include the impact of inflation, Americans keep on spending. Basically every month from the start of the year, retail sales keep moving higher. So that, at least on paper, is, I think, encouraging news. But what you also have to do is you have to incorporate the impact of inflation, because if your dollar doesn't go as far today as it did last year, you're not able to buy as much stuff as you would have with that same amount of money, right? Your purchasing power has decreased. So when you include the impact of inflation on those retail sales numbers, you're actually looking at a little bit of a stagnation, if not an outright pullback in sales up through the month of October. Now, how that relates to the consumer discretionary story, well, it's a pretty clear one-to-one link. Consumer discretionary has not done particularly well this year. We're leading up to the Black Friday holiday, down about 32% year to date. In the quarter, that is the worst performer we've seen thus far. From a year-to-date perspective, second worst performer that we've seen all year. Now, interestingly, multiples are still a little bit rich relative to history. I think that's probably because consumer discretionary is a pretty big category. It includes a lot of the online shopping giants, which kind of trend and trade more like tech names, like growth names, so they're priced accordingly. But the big story here is that things have sold off a lot. And I think investors are concerned mostly with what's going on with interest rates, because interest rates are going to do a couple of things. The first one is that the cost of borrowing is obviously going to increase, so it's harder for the consumer to borrow to purchase, which could, in theory, put some downward pressure on consumption. But we also know that higher interest rates may ultimately lead to a recession. In fact, a recession seems more likely than not.
That's right.
And if you do get a recession, if unemployment starts to creep up, if people are losing their jobs, maybe they're not able to spend as much as they had been before, that may put some downward pressure on consumer discretionary, right? Like, everybody's got to buy toilet paper and toothpaste. You don't need a new TV. So when things start to get a little bit more challenging, consumer discretionary is where the cuts are made.
Well, it's interesting, and you're right. Yes, toilet paper. We saw that in the beginning of the pandemic. Everybody ran out and bought all the toilet paper they can get their hands on. Then there were limits on it because you need that stuff. But one thing that was really interesting, and you look at a lot of these stats, and according to Adobe Analytics, I'm just reading here, we saw a 2.9% increase year over year in online sales on Black Friday, and another 2.9% increase in brick and mortar sales, which was surprising to me. Normally you see this ratio of, e-commerce going up and then the offline going down, but not this year. There was a lot of foot traffic, and it even seemed like people who were surveying it were saying people were actually carrying bags. They weren't just window shopping. What do you make of this, especially given the rise in inflation and all the uncertainty?
Yeah, well, let's say one thing, right? And it sounds kind of cheeky, but it's true. Retail therapy is a real thing for Americans, right? When we're not feeling so great, nothing cheers us up more than going out and buying something new, right? So just because economic conditions aren't that great, just because consumer confidence is kind of in the dumps, doesn't mean that we aren't going to spend. If anything, it actually may encourage us. I would also say, and maybe I'm just speaking at a personal level here, people are so sick of being stuck at home that the opportunity to get out there and go and spend in person, to feel the thing that you want to buy, to try it on, to see how it looks, right, that is so much more impactful than buying online. I think there's probably also a little bit of an interest here in supporting small businesses, supporting local businesses, because so many closed during COVID. That, I'm sure, is also encouraging more foot traffic. Is that going to stick around? I'm not sure. I don't think it changes the overall story around brick and mortar, which is that, people aren't really back to school shopping at shops in person anymore. It's mostly a luxury good phenomenon, but at least for this year it was encouraging. But in terms of the data in general, right, those 2.9% increases that we saw year over year for both figures, I do want to get back to this story here of nominal versus retail sales. Nominal just being the dollar that you spend, nominal versus real. Real being the dollar that you spend minus the impact of inflation. And those 2.9% growth figures that Adobe quotes are both nominal in nature. When you incorporate the impact of inflation, when you factor in the inflation, that number starts to go lower. Now, Adobe acknowledges that, and they say, look, inflation has eased off a little bit recently, which is true, which means that the demand story is still pretty robust, but you're not looking at 2.9% increase in terms of purchasing power. I think the number is a little bit softer.
I mean, the most recent reading of 7.7% CPI last month, it wasn't 7.7% last Thanksgiving, Black Friday. So yes, thank you for pointing that out. It's not quite apples to apples, right?
That's
but it seems like omni-channel, at least for this year, has been a little bit of a surprise. But here's another interesting thing that we've been reading about. It's this buy now, pay later option, and this is the where I used to call layaway, where my mom would go to the store, she'd say, I'm going to pay for this over time, but I'm going to pick it up from the store in 4 weeks, but they're going to hold it for me. It seems like companies are doing this kind of thing again. And interestingly, another interesting stat, 5% of shoppers over the past year utilize this service, but Black Friday, it went up to between 80 and 85%. So is this a sign of the times? Is it that people are thinking, I'd rather not spend all my money now and pay it off? What kind of impact does this maybe have on the retailers?
I would say that ultimately this is a question about the health of the consumer. And at least as things stand right now, the consumer is in reasonably good shape, right? If we break down the balance sheet, assets versus liabilities, assets going to outnumber liabilities roughly 8, 9, even close to 10 to 1. And in those liabilities, good portion are mortgages, but a good portion of those are fixed rate. So they're not necessarily feeling the impact of higher mortgage rates right now. So from that perspective, pretty good shape. We also know that there's still a lot of money sloshing around in the system, right? The government mailing out stimulus checks, supplemental unemployment insurance. People were flush with cash. And there is still about $1 trillion out there padding people's bank accounts that might not have otherwise been there a few years back. But it's not all roses, unfortunately, right? We do know that a lot of that money that is concentrated, or rather that is held by Americans, is concentrated in the hands of wealthier Americans. So those lower income, lower wealth individuals don't have as much of a buffer. And as a direct result of that, you are seeing credit utilization go up, and you've seen the personal savings rate drop down from an all-time high a couple of years ago to actually one of the lowest figures we've ever seen on record, which is kind of scary.
And that paints a really, really solid and scary picture.
Very scary, very solid, and I think it helps to explain exactly this phenomenon that you're talking about, right? Buy now, pay later. I can see why this is very appealing to consumers. It gives them a lot of flexibility, and I think it probably did help contribute to some of the strong gains that you had mentioned earlier. But this is not something that's going to last forever, right? Eventually, that bill comes due. And in today's world with higher interest rates, the cost of servicing that debt is getting higher and higher and higher. I would be very cautious about taking out big loans like this to buy a good that you may not necessarily need. I think if you are in the position where buy now, pay later is the only thing that makes sense for you, you should reconsider whatever it is that you are going to buy. And I don't think that from a retailer perspective, this trend is going to continue through next year.
And you made a really good point earlier before we started, is that if you miss if the person misses a payment, they're going to have to pay an exorbitantly high interest rate as a penalty. So it basically makes up for all the savings you might have had by doing this in the first place.
That's exactly
so
right.
A little bit of a cautionary tale for people out there. So thanks for that, Jack. Before we wrap, though, I wanted to ask you, because there are a lot of investors out there who are always looking to us and people like yourselves to say, hey, is this a good place to be putting my money right now? So if you think about consumer discretionary, and when you look more specifically at the retail subsector of that, are there opportunities right now, given what we've seen and what you might expect for next year?
So I would say, first of all, that unfortunately, there's no screaming valuation imbalance that exists within consumer discretionary, despite the poor performance that we talked about earlier. So this is not an obvious buy, at least from a valuation perspective. But when we try to figure out where the opportunities are, I like to answer the question, what's going to happen with the consumer next year? And I think that that's tied into what's going on with a recession, right? When a recession happens, we know the consumer is going to get hurt. The question is, are they stubbing their toe or are they breaking a bone, right? Or is it something even worse than that? And one of the statistics that we like to look at is the number of job openings versus the number of job seekers, right? How many jobs are open versus people that are looking for them. You can track that data going back about 70 years, and there have only been a handful of times in history when that number is above 1. Today, it's at 1.7. The highest it ever was a couple months ago at around 2, but this is about as high as it's ever been. Now, what I do is I interpret that and I say, okay, the Fed is raising interest rates. It's trying to slow down the economy. It's trying to get, say, wage growth under control. Well, if it's able to destroy some demand for labor, it may not necessarily result in a surge higher in the unemployment rate or a tick higher in layoffs like you typically see with other recessions. And
Powell basically said so himself 2 weeks ago when he was giving that speech.
That's what they're targeting.
He's hoping for flat job openings.
They don't want people to lose their jobs.
That's
they
right.
want demand for labor to come down. And if that is the case, then most people stay employed. Most people stay employed, they stay paid, and if they stay paid, they can keep spending. So I think from that perspective, right, while it may not be a valuation argument right now, I think that there are some more fundamental tailwinds for this sector moving into next year. And frankly, I think it paints the case for why you need to be in there, but you also need to be active, right? You need to be active in that space. You need to pick the right securities. You need to pick the right parts of that market.
Right, terrific. Yeah, and obviously that is a conversation that we always recommend all of you talk about with your financial advisor. So Jack, great conversation. I love the energy you bring to this. It's a great topic, and really appreciate you coming by. Please come back again soon.
I would love to. Thank you, Anthony.
Good to see you, Jack Manley, Global Market Strategist from JP Morgan Asset Management. And thank you all for joining us. And we encourage you to take a look at our website, all the great content that we have here from UBS, plus from our great partners like JP Morgan Asset Management and others are available at ubs.com/views, plus lots of content also up on social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, plus all of our past UBS Trending episodes, just like this one, are available for you to watch on demand. Again, it bears repeating. Questions, any questions you have about your portfolio or anything that Jack and I spoke about today, talk to a financial advisor. Until next time, I'm Anthony Pastore. Thank you for joining us, everybody, and remember to keep your eyes on what's trending. We will see you soon.